Chapter 15. I was just dropping off to sleep that night when I heard a sharp rap at my door. Jumping up, I opened it, and Tom rushed in. "I've just thought of something, Jim. The hinges did disappear from that blind. We struck the wrong house today, but we mustn't give up on that account. Suppose you go back to the lodging house in the morning and see if you can get any more light." "Sure thing," I answered. "But now, for heaven's sake, let me go to sleep." "Of course," said Tom in an aggrieved tone, "but I thought you'd want to hear about that as soon as I struck it." "Sure thing," I repeated again, "only now I know about it, go to bed, and let me do the same." My head touched the pillow as I heard the sound of the closing door, and then I slept the clock around. The next morning I started straight for Bloomsbury, to my destination of the morning before, the lodging house. My stout friend, the landlady, was out, so the maid informed me, but I could see the room again if I wished. Once on the top story, I flung open the window and gazed about me. The wilderness of brick was broken only by the waving boughs that kept this part of London from being quite the dreary waste that most modern cities are fast becoming, or have long since become. As I stood there striving to pierce the mystery, the maid stood at a shambling attention in the doorway. Finally I turned. "I was very much interested in the story your mistress told me of the falling shutter," I said, slipping a half-crown into her ready fingers. "I should very much like to know if any part of the old shutter is by any chance in existence?" The maid's eyes glistened as she glanced surreptitiously at the coin in her hand. "Rick's down into washhouse," she said. "You're from the coal pits or the mines," I said, smiling as I heard her dialect. A dim flush showed in her sallow cheeks. "I'm from about there, sir. Hast ever been there? There's none like it." "I've been there," I answered, smiling again. "There's some fine men there." Her eyes lighted once more. "Happen thou might like see the wreck? Canst if thou wish." "Just what I would like," I answered, and the maid turned and clattered down the stairs. Down in the basement, leaning against the wall beside some tubs, was the wrecked shutter. I brought it out to light. The hinges were gone. Not a bit of iron showed upon it. I turned to the silent maid. "Queer thing where the hinges went," I said questioningly. "No," she replied. "See the old box there?" "Yes," I answered. "Thought hinges. Michael took them today to shutter full." Eagerly I bent over the rude wood box and examined the hinges carefully, measuring them with my handkerchief and comparing the size with the lighter spots on the shutter, which showed where the hinges had been. There could be little doubt that what the girl said was true. One doubt remained. "Why did not your mistress know what became of the hinges?" I asked. "The mistress is rarely fogged, and don't know many a thing goes on," the maid explained. "But to a man that knows the coal pits—" She did not finish, but I understood, and a second half-crown lighter in purse, I walked away. All the way home the ludicrousness of our 24-hour comedy of errors kept growing on me, and I startled more than one passer-by with a sudden chuckle. Tom and Dorothy sprung up in alarm as I entered and leaned against the wall, weak with laughter. "Are you hurt, Jim?" cried Dorothy, anxiously turning towards me. No, I gasped. "But the disappearing iron hinge of the blind belongs in the same class as the dentist's laboratory. Michael put them on the wood box in the washhouse. That's where they disappeared to." The full beauty of the situation suddenly dawned upon Tom's mind, and he broke into inextinguishable laughter, while Dorothy, her face lighting with glee, joined in, a moment later, in silvery accord. The adventure of the two young men and the young woman who hunted the disappearing shutter of Bloomsbury ended with our mirth. Directly after lunch we started off towards Chelsea, up the embankment, past the Houses of Parliament and the Tate Gallery, by the broad stretches of Chelsea Hospital, where a few old pensioners were sunning themselves on the trim walk. Our motor car carried us to the very edges of the quaint old suburb. Our chauffeur had never heard of the street named in the clipping, and it was only after diligent search that we found the little back street, a mews, where stables and kennels alternated with houses of stablemen and farriers, where trig grooms in leggings, the chrysalides and pompous coachmen in severe livery, the full-grown moths, met on equal terms. At the end of the little street stood a small public house for the benefit of the yahoos who congregated in the neighborhood. As we passed it, Tom stopped the chauffeur. "I'll run in here," he said, and see what I can find." In 10 minutes he was back. "Have you found anything?" queried Dorothy, leaning forward. Tom nodded. "We'll leave the car here," he said laconically. "Come on with me." Down the little street and through an inner court Tom led the way. At length he entered a gate whose rounding arch supported a quaint carved horse's head that might well have seen the equipages of a century or more ago lumbering beneath. Within was a square paved courtyard. Straight ahead a boarded stable, on the right an old farrier's shop, whose disused bellows and forge showed through a dusty window. On the left a slatternly dwelling. A sign on the stable and the shop stated the whole premises were to let. "Inquire on the left of the yard." They told me in the pub that the sign hung over the gateway with a carved horse's head, said Tom. "It was called the sign of the 3 horses. I'm going to see if they know anything about it at the house." Dorothy and I waited by the gateway, while Tom crossed the yard. As he advanced, the door opened, and a tall, rectangular woman came out, clothespin in mouth and a piece of washing in her hands. A somewhat one-sided conversation followed. "I want to see the stable for rent," said Tom. Responded the woman from her half-closed mouth. "I beg your pardon," said Tom, "but I don't quite understand." Another mumble followed as the woman right about faced and walked into the house. Tom cast a comical look at us. "That's what comes of not learning the language of the country you're going into," he called in a loud aside. "I can talk German, French, or Italian, read Latin, and make a try at Greek, but I never studied a word of clothespin." As he ended, the woman reappeared, still grasping the garment for the line, but holding out as well 2 ponderous iron keys. Tom took them and turned to us, simply remarking, "We'll look the place over." Loft, stalls, and cellar of the stable offered us nothing, nor did we get more from the windows with their view of littered yards. The old farrier's shop looked better. Tom thrust the ponderous key into the lock and threw back the heavy door. Right where the sun cast its gleam down the dusty floor lay a little pile of painted boards. I sprang forward. "Sliced animals," I called to the others, as I brought the 6 or 7 old boards forward and began fitting them into place. I had them sorted and arranged in a trice. Bruised as they were by their fall, the 3 horses' heads on the signboard still showed clear, though the dimming effect of time had dulled the flaring tints of the rude artist. Not a nail in it or a bit of iron, though there were 6 nail holes to every board. "This can't be another woodbox hinge case," I remarked. As we all bent eagerly over the sign, a voice broke in on us. "That sign nearly cost us a pretty penny." We straightened up quickly. In the doorway stood a stout, red-whiskered man. "I'm the agent for the property," he said. "I heard you were looking it over, so I came across. We're ready to put it in good shape for any desirable tenant. There's few better stable properties in the Chelsea Mews." "Really?" said Tom. "I'm not sure whether this will meet my needs or not. We've just been looking things over and came upon this sign. It must have received a pretty severe blow, for every screw is out of it." "Well, sir," said the agent eagerly, "that's the very strangest thing I ever saw. I saw the sign go down. I was just across the yard here in that corner, and I happened to be looking out through the archway. There was no wind, not a breath of air stirring, and yet all of a sudden the old sign tumbled. A man had gone by not a minute before. It might just as well hit him as not, or hit me for that matter. And the pole that held it, and the nails and hinges and everything, must have flown out of it when it struck. Least I don't see what else could have happened to 'em. They weren't there when I came along, and they were good iron too. I looked that sign over myself inside of 2 months to make sure things were all right." Our voluble friend stopped for breath. As Tom addressed him, I spoke in an aside to Dorothy. "I always supposed years ago that the English were the most silent race on earth, but I'm finding out my mistake now. It's the upper classes that are silent, and the country people. Your Londoner can talk a blue streak once he gets going." Tom had stepped out into the yard with the agent to give us a further chance to look over the sign, and we were just about to make another examination of the nail holes, when Tom sung out to us, "Come out here, will you?" Out we came, to see the agent hurrying away, and Tom, with key in hand, ready to lock up. "I really believe we've got something this time," he said in a low voice. "It seems this chap is an understrapper of the agent of the Duke of Moir, who owns all this property about here. He tells me that he let 3 rooms to a man named Cragent, who occupied them as a workshop or a laboratory off and on for some months, and left about 2 days ago. Sometimes he'd be gone for months at a time. The man's gone off for the keys now. He's going to let us through the place. He tells me that Cragent probably made some changes, though he hasn't been inside the place yet." Tom ended. The agent returned with the keys, and we followed on. Just beyond the mews on the adjoining street, the agent mounted some stairs beside a little bake shop. The red-whiskered man slipped a key in the lock and threw open the door. Eagerly we pressed in. The bare room showed some slight litter left by their former occupant. Wrapping paper, broken bits of insulated wire, a shelf which showed behind it heavy disconnected wires which must have led to a motor generator, a sink with a high gooseneck tap. "It was a laboratory, all right," I said to Dorothy, who nodded and passed by into the 3rd room. She crossed directly to the rear window. "Look here, Jim," she called softly. Tom and the agent were left behind in the large center room. I followed Dorothy's pointing finger with my eyes as I reached her side. There, between the buildings, showed a narrow, open strip, which ended in the shadow of a dark arch, crowned by a rudely carved horse's head. It was the arch where the sign of the 3 horses had hung. "If this was the man's laboratory, his destructive power could have escaped from this window," murmured Dorothy. "Gone straight through and attacked that sign without meeting iron anywhere else on the way. Oh, Jim, do you suppose this room corresponded to Dr. Heidenmuller's wooden room? The man might have wooden panels to the windows and a double door, and taken them down when he left." I shook my head. "If enough of that deadly stuff got away to destroy the iron of the sign, it would destroy every nail inside the room, and here are iron nails holding the window casing together." "That's right," said Dorothy, as she inspected the nail heads. "Those do look like iron nails." Then she broke square off. "Got your knife in your pocket, Jim?" Silently I produced and opened it. "Now try to pry out that nail," she commanded, pointing to one on the window casing. I obeyed, with the full expectation of breaking my knife short off. To my utter surprise, the blade cut straight through the nail, with less resistance than the wood around it offered. The nail head was shorn away. Dorothy and I sprang at the same moment to pick it up, and we met in sudden collision. Only by the extraordinary presence of mind which I showed in clasping Dorothy closely in my arms was a complete spill averted. A soft tendril of the sweet spring woods swept my cheek, the velvet petal of a flower brushed by my lips, and my whole body was aflame. Scarcely the fraction of a second was Dorothy in my arms, yet it seemed as if eons of life had passed. As we scrambled to our feet, I could feel my face blazing. I looked at Dorothy. Her face was as suffused as mine felt. Just then Tom entered and stood gazing at us with a quizzical smile. "Head-on collision?" he exclaimed in mock alarm. "Another big accident?" Not a word did Dorothy reply to his badinage. She walked in an especially stately fashion to the window and stood gazing out, while I busied myself energetically in hunting once more for the end of the nail which my knife had shorn off. It was lying just by my side, and as I picked it up, it crumbled. "Why, these nail heads are putty!" I cried in amazement. "They're simply imitations of nails." In a minute, Tom's knife was in his hand, and quite forgetting everything else, he was hacking away at a point where another nail head showed. "Putty on top to represent an old nail head, and wooden peg doing the business below," he ejaculated. "I don't believe there's a bit of iron in the place." Tom dug at nail head after nail head, and each flew off. "Dorothy, it's a wooden room," he cried. "Oh, really?" said Dorothy in an entirely lifeless monotone. "And there is the horse's head out of that window. You must have been blind not to have seen it before." "We did see it," I said testily, "but you're so confoundedly impetuous you rush ahead before anybody can tell you anything." Tom paid but slight attention to my remarks. He was up on a windowsill, prying with his knife. "I've got it," he exclaimed finally in triumph. "Here's the place where they hung the wooden shutters on with wooden pegs, and they painted and puttied them over when they took the panels down." He leapt down and started towards the other room. "I'm going to find out what the agent knows," he called back over his shoulder. Dorothy stood still by the window. the late afternoon sun making a golden halo of her somewhat rumpled hair. As I watched her, there seemed to be something a trace less energetic in her posture. She was leaning against the window and gazing fixedly outward. She did not notice me at all. For 10 minutes we remained in a silence broken only when Tom returned, waving a dirty piece of paper triumphantly. "The agent didn't know where the chap had gone," he cried, "but I've got a line on him anyway. Here's the address of a dealer in electrical supplies, left in a corner on a scrap of paper. We'll drive straight to the city and look him up." Down the embankment the way we came, past the Savoy and the Temple, through Queen Victoria Street, and by the bank to Bishopsgate Street we ran. Dorothy sat beside me on the rear seat of the car, Tom next to the driver. All the way in she gave me hardly a word, scarcely replied to Tom's occasional chatter. I had never seen her tongue so strangely silent, her cheek so blushed with the morning crimson, nor had I ever seen her eyes more deeply thoughtful, more softly beautiful. We drew up before the supply store, and Tom hurried in, followed by Dorothy and myself. He wanted some wire of the same type as that last ordered by Mr. Cragent. Could they look up the order and let him have it? Certainly. No difficulty at all. The clerk went back to examine the order book, and I followed by his side. In the little dingy office at the rear stood a high desk, with the tall books above in an ordered row. Down came C. Cragent, page 116, said the index. As the clerk turned to the page, I glanced over his shoulder. Mr. H. Cragent. The Chelsea address was crossed out with a line. Written below were the words 9 Cheapside. That was all I wanted. I nodded to Tom as he gave a hurried order for the wire, and we were free for the new address. "This is the right one," said Dorothy quietly as we left the shop. "How do you know?" asked Tom. "It looks good, I'll admit, but I don't see how you can tell." "I don't know how I can tell," answered Dorothy in low tones, "but I feel sure this time as I haven't before." In 10 minutes we were at the corner nearest to the new address, had left the car, and were walking up the busy street. The sign above the door at 9 Cheapside proclaimed a haberdasher's shop within. The second story showed a dealer in notions, and the third and fourth held no signs. "There are leads from the power circuit running into that fourth story," said Tom as we passed. "Here's the door. No business cards for anything above the second. Come on, let's try next door." Up the stairs by a milliner's shop, past the third story to the fourth we climbed. A wing ran back with a gallery that opened on one side. At the rear was a short flight of steps, with a scuttle at the top, which opened out onto the roof. By good fortune this was unlocked, and we climbed through, out on the flat roof, into the maze of chimneys. Tom was a little ahead and reached the parapet on the side of number 9, while we were still at the scuttle. As he turned to the edge, he wheeled and beckoned to us expressively. We hurried forward. Below, on the fourth story, 3 shuttered windows faced us. In the center one, the wind had blown half the blind open. Behind it we gazed on a solid wooden panel, which filled the window from top to bottom, from side to side behind the glass. An exact duplicate of the window panels of Heidenmuller's wooden room, I whispered. Tom and Dorothy nodded silently. Chapter 16. Quietly we drew back from the parapet, and closing the scuttle behind us, started down the narrow stairs. At their base, Dorothy stopped suddenly. As Tom came up, he noticed her delay, and paused with his hand on the latch. "What is it, girl?" he asked, almost tenderly. "You think we ought to go on, do you?" asked Dorothy hesitatingly. "Of course we're going on," said Tom. "There's no question about it. That's what we're here for. What's the matter, anyway?" "Frankly, I don't know," said Dorothy slowly. "If we come through this all right, I'll try never to say a word again, but somehow... She broke off without finishing. "Cheer up, old girl," comforted Tom, putting his arm about her waist. "What should we do without your valiant spirit?" I stood there mute. This was a new Dorothy, a silent, questioning woman, different from the one I knew, and yet like her. I could not seem to collect my scattered wits enough to be of any service. With an effort, Dorothy squared her shoulders. "Come on," she said firmly, and we started out for the door, Tom and I a couple of steps behind. "Good for you," I whispered as we turned in beside the haberdasher's shop and started up the stairs, at whose top we were forced to believe stood the laboratory of the man we sought, the workshop of the man who was trying to stop all war. As we reached the second landing, Tom turned to me. "This is the queerest mixture of fireproof and fire trap I've ever heard of," he ejaculated. "Iron stairs and wooden landings, with 2 doors on each side. Wonder if it keeps on like this all the way up." It did. Iron stairs and wooden landings succeeded each other till the 4th story showed 2 doors, one on either side of a landing dimly illuminated by a skylight. "It's one of the 2, whispered Tom. He tried one door softly, locked. Tried the other. To my surprise, it opened, and a bare room much like that where Tom and I had waited through the weary hours in Bloomsbury met our view. Just at that moment we heard a footstep clang on the iron stair below, and around the bend the handle of a broom came into sight, followed by an arm clad in the sleeve of a coarse jumper. The janitor halted in amazement as he saw our phalanx of 3 standing in the empty room. Before he could open his mouth, I addressed him. "I want to rent this room," I said. "It suits me in many ways. What's the rent?" £4 a month, sir. "Thank you," came the answer. "Anybody else on this same story?" I asked. "Just Mr. Cragent, thank you, sir, who has a workshop across the way. He's out for good today, but he's been in and out quite a bit the few days he's been here. Thank you, sir. I think he'll make you no trouble, sir." I looked at Tom and Dorothy, who signed affirmatively. "I'll take it," I said. "Shall I have to see the agent?" "No, sir, thank you," answered the man. "I'm the acting agent for this one building." "Very well, then. Here you are." I handed over £4 for the first month's rent, and turned back to survey my new-found quarters more carefully. It was evidently one of 2 front rooms looking out on the street. The other front room, with the rooms in the wing which stretched back, must belong to the mysterious Cragent. Sullied with fog and smoke, our place was a typical London office, whose grey marble mantel and grate was the only relief to the naked walls. The janitor, without a sign of wonder at our sudden invasion of his premises, turned with his broom and clanged down the iron stairs. Tom and Dorothy and I went inside and nearly closed the door, leaving it open a crack for the purpose of observation. "As long as we may have to be here off and on for a week or more, we may just as well be comfortable about it," said Tom in a low tone. "2 of us can stay here while the other one goes and gets some chairs and a little coal. You and Dorothy keep on the lookout while I get enough furnishings to make us comfortable for a few hours." "Sure thing," I said, my heart leaping at the chance of a short tete-a-tete with Dorothy. "I'm going with you, Tom," said Dorothy. "Jim can watch alone, all right." And she started out on the landing ahead of her brother. Tom threw one glance at me. "See you shortly," he said, and followed. I resumed my place of watching. Half an hour passed, and Tom and Dorothy were back with porters, carrying a table, chairs, and coal. In 10 minutes after their arrival, there was a brisk fire in the grate. We were comfortably disposed about it, and the porters had departed. Dorothy sat gazing into the fire with the same dreamy quiet which had so characterized her appearance for the last few days. I sat watching Dorothy, and Tom was busy lighting his pipe. Suddenly I heard a slight and repeated noise. With a sign to Tom, I rose and tiptoed to the door. There was no one coming up. I went to the landing and listened. No more result. Yet I had surely heard footsteps. I went back into the room and closed the door. Tom was beside me in a moment, pipe in hand, but as I cast a hurried glance about me, I saw that Dorothy had not stirred. She still sat, her head on her hand, gazing into the glowing coals. The footsteps were louder now, and I went to one boundary wall and then to another. There was someone pacing up and down in Cragent's rooms. Tom was beside me as I bent to listen, his face the picture of eagerness. "There must have been someone in there all the time," I whispered. "But if there was, I should have thought he would have been disturbed by our moving in, and would have come out." "The janitor told me that Cragent had not come in, and that there was no one working with him," muttered Tom. "I don't see through it." Back and forth went the steps. Tom put his pipe in his mouth and began smoking with long, regular puffs. "I believe there's another entrance to these rooms," he said finally. "I'm going out to reconnoiter." Silently and carefully he tiptoed out, without Dorothy's knowing of his departure. I brought my chair over near the wall and sat down to wait. A hush followed, broken only by the incessant low roar of the city, that roar which to the attentive ear in its deep, firm bass is wholly differentiated from the shrill staccato of New York, the lower, swifter tones of Paris, or the middle-toned, ordered hum of Berlin. On the other side of the wall, the steps went 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, turn, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, turn. On and on, with unvarying regularity, marched the heavy, thrusting step that reverberated over the old floor. Dorothy sat motionless, her eyes still fixed upon the fire, oblivious to the world, her soft hair contrasting with the rich fur of her coat lying draped over the back of an old chair. I heard the slow creak of an opening door and went softly toward a beckoning arm in gray. "I won't come in," whispered Tom excitedly. "I've got the trick. There's another entrance to his rooms. We'll cage him between us and get a good look at him anyway. There's a little office corresponding to this on the other side where I can wait. You stay by the bay window and watch for me. If he comes my way, wave to me. If he comes yours, I'll wave to you. Gee, I haven't had more fun for an age." Off Tom traveled, down the stairs, walking with an exaggerated caution, and I turned in, smiling. Dorothy had not roused at the interruption. I began to worry a bit about this strange abstractedness. Could she be quite well? No, that was quite foolish, for she seemed the picture of health. Then the footsteps took my attention for a moment. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, turn and repeat. It was like the trampling of feet in the Tale of Two Cities. The single footstep seemed to swell into a roar of charging troops. Was this Walker the man who was trying to stop all war? Were the footsteps above and around those of the thousands he had slain, or that he was to slay? Were we marching among the ghostly shades of the future? Were we in that crowding throng? What dreadful mystery lay behind the wooden panels of those windows? I fell to speculating on the appearance of the stranger behind the wall, and always the form of the man who was trying to stop all war took on the slight graceful form of a Southerner, and the face was the clear swarthy face of Regnier. Try as I might, I could not give the shadowy man we pursued any other face or form. The footsteps went on and on. Dorothy aroused. "Where's Tom?" she said, looking around. "He's away for a moment," I said, slightly mendaciously. "He'll be back shortly." "He ought to have told me he was going," she said, a little impatiently. But her reverie proved too strong for her to escape, and she sank back into her dreamy abstraction. The twilight began to come down as we sat watching, and as I listened. As it fell, the fire's rose played yet more softly on Dorothy's beautiful hands lying on the arm of her chair, showed a bit of rounded cheek and a translucent shell-like ear. Gradually I forgot my whole mission. The man became a ghost and faded silently away. Tom, waiting on tiptoe in the office next door, was quite forgotten. Dorothy and I and the fire. This new Dorothy, dreamy, quiet, almost clinging, with those new depths in her eyes, was carrying me quite beyond myself. "Dorothy," I said, in a low voice. "Dorothy." She turned. "What is it, Jim?" I tried to speak, but I could not. The rushing words overwhelmed me. I could not make myself intelligible, and I sat there shivering with the intensity of my feelings, and yet unable to say what I wished. I found my voice again. "Dorothy," I began, "I want to tell you." Dorothy's eyes met mine for a moment, and then her long lashes fell. "I've been thinking," she stammered. Thinking. I bent forward eagerly. "Of our old home on Long Island Sound." The words came with a rush, as if she had just seized them from the air. "You never went down there, but it's the loveliest place," she went on hurriedly. "The sea in a great crescent bay, paved with the whitest sand, and an old colonial house on a little rise." She was talking at top speed now. "But, Dorothy," I broke in, "I want you to know—" She gave me no chance to finish. "Tom has a laboratory that he has fitted up down by the shore," she went on, still more swiftly, the words fairly tumbling over each other. "And we work there when we're not off on the Black Arrow. When we get back, I'm going straight down. I want to see the place so badly." "Dorothy," I began again. "Oh, and did you see the account of the reception at the Ambassador's?" said Dorothy, as hastily as before. They had the whole thing twisted upside down, names all tangled up. They got Tom's name as Professor Thomas Orrington, and you as James." She stopped short. "How did they get yours?" I asked eagerly. "Did you see that they are tearing up the embankment down by the obelisk?" was the extremely pertinent reply, as all three of us had spent a quarter of an hour a day or two before watching those same operations. It seemed probable that I had seen them. "But Dorothy," I pleaded, "just a minute. I want to—" Dorothy sprung from her chair and started for the door. I'm going to find Tom," she said. "Stop," I called in a low voice. "The man is on the other side of the partition, walking up and down. Listen." Dorothy stood still for a moment in the very poise of flight, and we both listened intently. The roar of the city was the only sound. The measured footsteps had ceased. When they had stopped, I had no idea. I had proved an unfaithful watcher. "Then for heaven's sake, where's Tom?" I cried as I rushed to the window. Dorothy, surprised from her attitude, followed me. I gazed from the window up and down the house fronts and street. Tom was nowhere in sight. Dorothy leaned forward beside me to look out, and in the intoxication of her immediate presence, every idea beside my wish to tell her of my love was swept away. I seized her hand. "Dorothy," I exclaimed, "you must and shall hear what I am going to say." Her hand, at first fluttering and striving to escape, gave up its struggle, and she stood silent, listening with averted head. "Dorothy," I began again. At that very moment the door flew open, and Tom, red and breathless, dashed into the room. Dorothy sprang towards him like a startled fawn, and I was left with outstretched hand, the modern Tantalus of London. Tom was too excited to notice our positions. "Well, I must say you're a pretty pair," he exclaimed. "All this work and trouble gone for nothing, because you wouldn't take a little bit of care at the end. You call yourself a newspaper man? There's only one department you can handle, and that's the obituary column." "What's the matter?" I asked, coming down to earth. "Matter?" cried Tom disgustedly. "The whole thing's up so far as this clue is concerned, and we've got to start in all over again. I've seen the man, and if you had been even reasonably alert, you'd have seen him too, and we would have had him trapped." "You've seen the man? Are you sure?" asked Dorothy breathlessly. Tom nodded gravely. "I have, and I think for some reason that he knew me," he answered more slowly. "When I left you, I went over to the office on the other side and waited. I just sat where I could see if anyone opened on my side. I had been there perhaps half an hour when the door opened, and a man in a slouch hat, whose face was hidden in the dim twilight of the hall, stepped out. Just as he caught sight of me, he jumped back and locked the door. 'That's the time for Jim,' I said to myself, and ran to the window and waved. I could have waved my arm off, I believe, and you would never have known it. So when I realized that, I hurried down and over to these stairs. On the third flight, I heard steps coming down the fourth. I came up very softly, and there, just ascending, was the man in the slouch hat. When he saw me, he threw up his arm across his face, said what sounded to me like "you again," and backed away into the darkness of the corner. I followed, but before I could reach him, a door behind him flew open, and he dashed through, slamming it in my face. I flew against the door, and it gave. By the time I was in the room, he was across it and out the other door. I followed him down the stairs, but lost him in the street. If you people had been half decently on the watch, we'd have had something. But now he knows we're after him, and he'll simply disappear from here. But I believe I've seen that chap somewhere before. There was a queer familiarity about him. And what did he mean by "you again"? It's barely possible that your old theory may be right, Jim, or it may be that you have driven Regnier so into my head that I look to find him in a man I don't know at all. Well, I know, said Dorothy, with a sudden reversion to her old independent spirit. It isn't. But how did the man happen to have keys in his hand for those doors on the story below? I don't understand that. I don't know, I'm sure, said Tom. I was in too much of a hurry to get at the chap to pay any attention to the way he unlocked the doors. Of course, there is a bare chance that the fellow may be a harmless citizen who mistook me for either a highwayman or a lunatic. Not with the wooden panels on the windows, said Dorothy. Let's go down and look at the doors. Regretfully, I locked the door and left the bright fire and bare-walled room where Dorothy had come so near to listening to me. I was disappointed. Of course I was disappointed at my carelessness in losing the man I sought, but Dorothy's hand had lain in mine without struggling, In that last instant of time before Tom came in, there was some balm in Gilead. Yet delays are dangerous, and I felt I must not lose time in following up any advantage gained. As I turned the corner of the stairs, I heard a low exclamation from Dorothy and Tom's expressive whistle. They were bending over an open door, examining the lock with a match, which Tom held shielded between his palms. As I joined them, Tom pointed without comment at the place where the lock had been. Its bare wood showed lighter surfaces, as the signs had showed the marks of the handiwork of the man, and nail holes that told of disappearing metal. "How's that for a pick lock?" said Tom. "The other one was opened in just the same way. Cragent is the man, and I saw him, but I couldn't reach him. What a control he must have over his instrument to be able to destroy a battleship and open the lock of a door by means of disappearing metal." Dorothy shuddered. "It's dark here and cold. I want to go back to the hotel," she said, a little tremulously. "I'll be all right in the morning, and I'll go with you after the man, but now I'm tired. I think the horror of the thing shadowed us all a bit in that gloomy old London house. The darkness of the corners, the man who had slain so many of his fellow men, separated from us by a single partition, seemed gruesome and deadening. Those footsteps pacing up and down, did they mean more slaughter? New inventions? Was the mysterious man whom we had sought the familiar figure Tom had imagined? And dominating thought of all, did Dorothy's hand rest in mine without struggling that last moment? There was enough to keep my thoughts at work on the way home, even though Dorothy persistently gazed from the window of the four-wheeler and uttered never a word. As we left the carriage, Tom broke silence. "If you feel like it, Jim, I think it wouldn't be a bad plan to look up Hammerly tonight and see what he says to all this." "A good idea," I said. "I'll get a hasty bite and run up there. No use in wasting time." "All right," said Tom, and Dorothy, as we parted, gave me one shy glance that sent me away in a golden maze of joy and hope. Hammerly was out when I arrived at his lodgings, called away suddenly for a couple of days, the maid reported. On my way back, however, I came to one very definite conclusion. Hammerly must have seen the man face to face in Dr. Heidenmuller's laboratory. He could settle one vexed question anyway. I was going to find a picture of Regnier, if there was one to be had. I reached the Savoy to find word from Tom that he and Dorothy had gone over to the Cecil to see some friends. I followed, leaving word at the office that I had gone. As I stood in the corridor waiting, a page came by, calling my name for the telephone. I took up the receiver with a deep thrill of anticipation. "Orrington?" Yes, it was one of her correspondents. "War just declared between England and Germany. I have inside information that the fleets will meet in the Channel tomorrow off Dover. I suppose you'll hunt your man there?" "I'm off for the scene of battle by the first train," I answered. "Much obliged," and I hung up the receiver. As I stepped out under the great awning at the head of the courtyard, the gaiety and life of the full tide of evening was sweeping through. Beautifully dressed women, gallant men, life and youth and pleasure. And tomorrow? What? Would a single one of those mighty ships, would one of those brave sailors return? As I stood there, a hush came. The news which I had heard had just been received. Then came a mighty roar. "War! War! War!" Then, as it died away, out burst a great increasing wave of song, the whole multitude joining in one mighty chorus, "God save the King." I saw Dorothy hastening towards me, her lips quivering. "Jim, have you got to go to sea?" she said, stammering. "I'm so afraid no boat will ever return." And she ended with a sob. I could wait no longer. "Dear love," I said, "I must, but I love you, dear. And if I die tomorrow or 50 years off, I love you and you alone." And there, as the last bars of the song rang forth in the full tide of exultation, as the clamor of the crowded street outside rose to its height, Dorothy and I came to our own. Chapter 17. As we stood there in the hush that followed the last bars of the song, Tom came towards us. Dorothy turned to him, starry-eyed, and he looked quickly at me. I nodded. Tom smiled widely as he stretched out his hand. "Nobody else in the world I'd as soon would have her, old man," he said, as he nearly wrung my hand off. Then, turning to his sister, "Well, little girl, so you've waked up at last to the real state of things?" Dorothy clung to his arm. Tom, dear, I have, and I'm very happy. But," her voice broke, "it may only be for to-night. Jim leaves at once for the fleet. He's going out to watch the battle, and if the man sends out his waves to sink those ships, I'm afraid he'll sink every other boat anywhere near." "This, my children," said Tom, with a flowing gesture, "is where your old Uncle Thomas steps in as the benevolent fairy who saves the handsome lover of the beautiful young princess." Dorothy looked at him, her whole soul in her eyes. "Tom, don't joke. Have you any way by which Jim can go and be safe? I can't ask him to stay behind for me when he ought to go." "Dorothy," said Tom seriously, "I think Jim can go and be perfectly safe. I thought this whole business out, coming over in the boat. Not being completely and totally blind, I foresaw the inevitable occurrence which has inevitably occurred, and I didn't want to lose Jim for my own sake, as well as my sister's. I've had this on my mind ever since we left Portsmouth. I knew he'd think he ought to go, so as soon as I reached Folkestone I had a little yacht built, a sloop with an auxiliary motor which hasn't a nail in her. She's all wood, rubber, and canvas, except the engine, and if the engine disappears, there's a set of rubber valves that instantly closes the shaft hole. The man can come right up alongside, stand up, and throw waves at her, and she can't sink. I had a wire from there tonight that she was done. They've been working on her 24 hours a day since I started her, and she's a mighty nice little boat. The crew is engaged, and all Jim has to do is take possession." "That ought to save the boat," Dorothy said, shaking her head sadly. "But how can you save Jim from the fate of Dr. Heidenmuller, or of the men on the battleships who died as he did?" "You never did have much opinion of my brains, Dorothy," said Tom. "Don't you suppose I thought of the effect those waves would have? You know none of the other ships in Portsmouth Harbor were injured when the German ships disappeared. That proves that the man has some way of directing his waves, so he may not hurt Jim at all. But I didn't take any chances on that. I've had a cage of caema built over the cockpit, and everything is arranged so that the boat can be run without going outside that cage." Dorothy heaved a sigh of relief. She bent forward and kissed Tom in the full face of the assembly. "Tom, you're the finest, best man in the world, except one." "That's it," said Tom with a grin. "Second place for old Uncle Thomas now." "But Tom," I said, "I follow the boat construction all right, but for heaven's sake, what is this caema that I've heard so much about, and what's the use of the cage?" "Oh, I forgot you might not understand that," said Tom. "You know, or you ought to know, it's in every school physics, that if you put a cage of a conductor like copper around any instrument which is easily affected by any electrical discharge, the electrical waves spread out, follow the surface of the cage, and don't penetrate the interior. The instrument is wholly unaffected. Well, caema is the newest organic conductor. It acts the same way with any radioactive waves. They spread out all over it, and it can't get through. I've had a cage built of it to insulate you and everything else that's inside." "Why wouldn't it work around the battleships then?" I asked. "Because the battleships are made of steel, and if you put a cage like that around them, they could hardly move. It only worked on your boat because it's wood outside." "Tom," I said gravely, "I imagine your forethought and knowledge will save my life." "I know it will," said Tom cheerfully. "Now, what time do you leave?" "In 55 minutes from Charing Cross on the Channel Express," I said. "We'll go with you to Folkestone," said Tom. "Of course," said Dorothy. A few minutes at the Savoy, a brief ride down the lighted Strand in the midst of the noisy crowds, a moment in the rush of the station, and a long ride in the darkness in a full compartment brought us back to Folkestone. All the way down I held Dorothy's hand in my own. All the way down her warm body was close to mine. Despite all Tom's precautions, something might go wrong. But if it ended tonight, we had this, and hope persisted that it would not end tonight, that, on the other hand, this was the beginning of many happy years. The crew of 3 was on board the little yacht, which looked no different in the dark from any other boat, though as we came alongside in the skiff I could just see a cage of some dark substance above the cockpit. We entered through a lattice door toward the bow, and Tom for half an hour examined every part of the boat with a lantern, the caema screen most vigilantly of all. Dorothy and I sat close together, watching the lights and their reflection in the water. All about the pier was hurry and movement. 3 tugs bearing correspondence passed us as we lay at anchor, and half a dozen dispatch boats and cutters. Tom came up to us at last. "Jim, if you keep the door of the cage fastened, nothing can happen to you." "Don't be foolhardy, though, for my sake," said Dorothy. "Come, Dorothy, we must go. It's time for Jim to start," said Tom gently, and I strained Dorothy to my heart and felt her wet cheek against mine. "I'll be back safely, dear love," I whispered, as I helped her into the waiting boat. Tom wrung my hand as he left. "Jim, I'd go with you, but I think I ought to stay with Dorothy." "I know you ought," I replied, and they cast off. As we started off into the blackness, Dorothy's clear "Till we meet again, dear," were the last words that reached me. Our London office had been able to obtain pretty definite information as regards the whereabouts of the fleet, and our little boat was a marvel of swiftness. So it was with no great surprise that, as the morning dawned, I saw far ahead of me, off the port bow, the rear ships of the squadron going slowly ahead, and shortly after came in sight of the whole fleet. My binoculars showed the greatest spectacle I had ever beheld. From east and west, from north and south, had come the hurrying ships to guard the coasts of the great island empire from attack. I counted 40 mighty ships as I gazed. In regular formation they went onward, slowly, disdainfully, proudly. Somewhere to the north, beyond that grey line which bordered my view on every side, another fleet was coming. At best, it was to be the greatest trial of naval strength the world had ever seen. All other naval battles would sink into obscurity before this, in which were met the utmost resources of Germany and England. At worst, it would be a series of dumb, helpless disasters, as the fleet, stricken by an unseen, unknown foe, would perish. Near me were 2 of the boats bearing men from the papers. The men on them jeered as they saw our dark cage, and passed uncomplimentary remarks on the appearance of my boat. I kept silence, watching the line of sky and sea. Out on the farthest point, at last I saw a dot, and then half a dozen more, then more, and I counted up to 30. Over on my right a great splash of water rose, and a dull reverberation sounded. Germany had fired the first shot. The flagship of the English admiral was nearest me, on the extreme left of the line. As I watched, I saw the great ship turn slightly, and I knew by the sound that they had fired in return. Sight availed nothing in telling whence came the shot, for the newest smokeless powder left no trace. The ship swung back on her course, the great flag of the Empire hanging at her stern, scarce lifted by the breeze. I could see figures, through my powerful glasses, hurrying about the decks, and 3 or 4 officers on the bridge peering through their glasses at the enemy. I had focused wholly on the British flagship, and watched intently for her next move. Suddenly my lenses grew blank. I was staring at sea and sky. The grey waves, rising and falling, filled the field. The battleship had disappeared. I dropped my glasses in utter amaze. I found myself once more repeating the words of Jocelyn concerning the Alaska. Vanished like a bursting soap bubble. I looked to right and left. I raised my glasses. Of all that company of men, of all those implements of war and of destruction, not one thing remained. Yes, there was a dark spot on a lifting wave. Eagerly I trained my lenses on it. Now it came up on a higher wave, a gleam of color. It was like cloth. Again it rose. It was the flag of England. Alone it had survived. The man was at work. Where would he strike next? The rest of the fleet went on, as if no blow had come. Not by a sign did they show what had come upon them. I glanced at my wire screen, and at my crew, who stood in a huddled group. The correspondents in the boats nearby were standing with white faces, peering ahead. I turned my glasses on the German fleet. The leading ship was coming forward under full steam. A shot struck just to my right, and I realized that peril might come from other sources than from the man who was stopping all war. But it was all in the game of life. My part in the game just then was to be at that very place, and I thrust back the thought of parting with Dorothy, that, despite myself, arose. I found myself counting aloud. Through my glasses I gazed fixedly at the German ship as she came on. Then, as before, came the utter blankness, the grey sky, and the waves rising and falling. 1 English ship and 1 German. Where would he strike next? As I asked the question, another English ship disappeared more swiftly than a cloud of light smoke scattered by the wind. I found myself counting aloud. In a state of utter unconsciousness as to anything else, I gazed fixedly to see which would go next. 4, I counted, as a German cruiser off on the right went down. 5, 6! They were going at the rate of 1 every 2 or 3 minutes now. The man must be in one spot, and he has the range now, I said to myself, as 2 more ships disappeared. Those ships that remained were firing rapidly. Now and again a shot would hit, and a cloud of steel fly out from a turret, or a big hole appear in the side. Their brothers were dying an awful death. The sister ships of a fleet were disappearing before their eyes, but the men who directed those grey bulldogs of war kept on. In a perfect frenzy of excitement, I cheered aloud. "Oh, plucky! Plucky!" I cried, as the squadrons, closing their thinned ranks, bore down on each other. 20 had gone from 82, destroyed by this wonder worker. 10 of the rest were in sore straits. Shots were falling on every side of me, but in the mad excitement of the moment I heeded them no more than if they had been paper pellets. Then the death-dealing machine seemed suddenly to accelerate its action. 25, 26, 27, 28! I counted slowly. The fleets never changed a point of their course. Not by a gun was the fire slackened, save in a few ships disabled by the enemy. The 40th ship had disappeared for 10 minutes. Then, as by a common understanding, the fire of each side slackened for a moment as the ships, closing up their ranks, maneuvered for new positions. In the lessening din I could hear the chug-chug of the little motor of our boat. That sound always carried me back to the night when Dorothy and I sought the man who saw the Alaska go down, the dark Jersey shore, the little launch, and Dorothy beside me suddenly rose before my eyes, and I was there, not in the midst of this awful carnage. But it was only for a moment. The pause in the work of destruction ended almost as it began. One after another, 22 ships more went down, and the antagonists, who had started with 82 of the proudest ships that any empire ever sent forth, were reduced to a shattered remnant of 20. Then suddenly they gave way. Flesh and blood could stand no more. Slowly but proudly as ever, and with no haste of flight, the Germans drew off to the north, the English to the south. As they parted, another ship and yet another disappeared. I groaned in impotent agony. "Spare them! Spare the rest!" I cried wildly. "Can't you see they have given up the fight?" Remorselessness in his purpose, the man went on. Again and again, with measured blows, he struck the retreating fleet. One by one their existence ended. And now the sunlit ripples of the channel rose and fell, where a moment before had sailed these massive hulks. I veiled my eyes at the close, but opened them as I felt a touch on my shoulder. "Are we to be killed too, sir?" said my skipper, with twitching lips and corded brow, where the cold sweat stood in great drops. "Can we go now, sir?" I nodded numbly as we started. The only boats in sight were 2 boats of the newspapers that had lain in apathy near us, and as they saw us start, their skippers started too. The correspondents on their decks sat in stricken attitudes. Not one was writing. They crouched, huddled together like men dying from cold. The 3 boats ran towards shore side by side. With fixed gaze I followed the one on the right. Suddenly she also disappeared. I fell into a wild rage. "You fool! You fool!" I cried, shaking my fist. "Don't you know a non-combatant?" The men on the boat to the left rose in an agony of alarm, shouted incoherently, waved handkerchiefs. My fury suddenly became extinct, and I watched them apathetically. It would be their turn next, or ours. I had lost all faith in Tom's protective schemes. One thing ran back and forth in my brain. If I had only married Dorothy before I came, she could have worn black. Now, as it was, would she or wouldn't she? That was the one thing which distressed me. They say a man awaiting instant death thinks over all in his past life. I didn't. I only worried as to whether Dorothy would or would not wear black. I looked up wearily. The sea was blank. The other boat had gone. So you went first, I said, calmly enough now. I've always wondered what the next world was like. Now I'm going to know. Ceaselessly went the chug-chug of the engine. Back and forth into the shuttle of my thought went the Jersey coast, and the problem of whether or not Dorothy would wear black. The noise ceased in an instant, and I wondered at it dully. The crew sat heavily in the stern, the skipper holding the wheel. I could see his brown, knotted hands white with the anguished grip with which he clasped its rim. We lay in the long swell of the channel in utter silence. Of all those thousands, we were left alone, rising and falling on the billows, absolutely without energy and without the slightest desire to act. The motor stopped. We could hoist the mainsail from the cage, but we thought of no such thing. For minutes, which seemed like hours, we lay there while I gazed indifferently at the water. A hoarse cry from the skipper aroused me. "Looky there!" he shouted. I turned at the command and started. Scarce 100 yards away was the conning tower of a submarine above the waves. Its top was open, and a man's head, the face masked with huge goggles, faced us. As I gazed with open mouth, the head disappeared, the top closed, and the conning tower sunk beneath the waves. I had seen the man. The sight somehow galvanized me into energy. Now I had seen that the antagonist was a human being and not a superhuman power. I would fight for my life. I ordered the sail raised through the cage, taking great care not to disturb it, and we started slowly back to Folkestone. Hours later, as we came up towards the harbor, I saw a yacht approaching. On the bridge were 3 figures. There was the flutter of a white dress beside the man at the wheel. As they came nearer, I saw it was the yacht I had chartered for our hunt in the Channel. The man and the girl on the bridge were Tom and Dorothy. As they came alongside, Tom called, "What happened?" I raised my head. "We 4 are all that are left," I said sadly. Chapter 18. As I came over the side of the yacht, Dorothy was at the rail and in a moment was in my arms. Thank God, you're back," she murmured. "You are back and the awful waiting is over. But how many wives and sweethearts will wait all the rest of their lives?" Tom was but a moment behind his sister. "Do you mean to say that every boat without exception has gone?" he questioned. "Every one within my range of vision. Between 80 and 90 in all," I answered. "Good God, what a catastrophe!" said Tom dazedly. "I can't realize it." My little yacht was still alongside, and the skipper now hailed us. "Mr. Orrington, sir, could somebody else take our boat in, and could we go with you? I think, sir, we'd feel easier if we could go with you." There was something to do. In a few minutes an exchange had been made, and my crew was on the larger yacht. As they came over the rail, Tom met them with a low request to keep their mouths shut. "Don't fear us," said my skipper. "We're alive, and that's all we ask for. We don't have any call or wish to talk about it. Do we, mates?" The other men shook their heads dumbly, and went slowly to their places. "What became of your propeller?" asked Tom, coming back towards us. "Disappeared. Your rubber valves closed the hole." "Then he tried to sink you?" "Undoubtedly," I answered. "It was your wooden boat and cage of caema which saved me." As we made for Folkestone, we met other boats hurrying out on the channel. Tom had ventured out farther than anyone else. One by one they hailed us, but our captain gave them no news and made on. "I wish I knew what to do," I said wearily. "I can't write this thing. I feel stunned and broken. I'm not sure what I ought to do anyway. Any ordinary or even extraordinary thing is proper journalistic stuff, but this is too big, somehow, for individual use. Yet the one thing that ought to be done is to get the news to the world as soon as possible." "I don't know what to tell you," said Dorothy, hesitatingly. "Isn't your London correspondent to be in Folkestone waiting for you?" "Yes," I said. "We'll ask him. You and I will go ashore, and Tom can put out with the yacht. Then there will be no chance of the sailors telling anything." "All right," I answered. "I don't seem to care what happens." Folkestone Pier was a black mass of people looking out to sea as we came in. and a surging crowd came towards us as Dorothy and I landed, while our boat, with Tom in the stern, shot back towards the yacht. Had it not been for 3 or 4 policemen, we could not have forced our way through the jam, but by their aid we managed to struggle through, shaking our heads in response to the 1,000 questions. As the human tide ebbed back towards the end of the pier, I heard my name and turned. It was Maxwell, our London correspondent. "What news?" he asked eagerly, when he reached me. "I'll tell you if you get us out of this crowd," I answered. "I've got a motor here. Come on," he said, and we made our way out, boarded the motor, and started slowly off. I looked at the chauffeur. "Run out to a quiet place where we can be alone, will you?" I said to Maxwell. In a few moments we had cleared the town and were on the bluff above the sea. There was no one around. "This will do," I said. As we descended, Maxwell looked questioningly at Dorothy. "This is my fiancée, Miss Haldane," I explained. "I forgot to introduce you. She knows the whole story." Just where we paused, an iron seat faced the wide expanse of blue and shining water, and for a moment I gazed out over the channel and breathed a silent prayer of thanksgiving for my escape, of remembrance for the men who lay beneath that flood. Then I turned and began my story. Ere I had spoken a dozen words, Maxwell had his notebook out, writing rapidly. Throughout he wrote without a question, without a word. As I ended, he closed his notebook slowly. "What we want to know, Mr. Maxwell," said Dorothy anxiously, "is the right thing to do. Should this go straight to the paper, or ought it go first to the English government? You see, there's probably no living man who saw this except Jim and his sailors, and we want to do right. We want to do right by the men that died and the people that remain." Wise, able, thoughtful, a scholar and a gentleman, a great journalist, a man who counted among his friends the greatest men of 2 countries, no man could be found who could decide such a question better than Maxwell. He looked at Dorothy. "That was the very question in my mind, Miss Haldane," he answered. "But I think there's only one answer. I believe we should take this straight to the king. He is at Buckingham Palace, and I believe we should go directly to him with the story. I have met him a number of times, and I know we can get an audience immediately." "I'm very glad you think so," I said. "How about the trains?" "We can do better in my car," he replied. 10 minutes for gasoline, and we started off. Through quiet villages where red farmhouses stood framed in vivid green, by tower and manor house embowered in ancient oaks, through hedgerowed land and city street we sped, till the rows of the villas, each modelled from a single type, showed the outskirts of London. Then, at a slower pace, we passed through a smoky fog, across the river by the Abbey, to the long front of Buckingham Palace. All the way we sat silent under the heavy burden of the news that brought the end of those long centuries of unconquerable British power. No enemy who could be conquered had they met. The day had come for peace, and Britain and Germany had been the greatest sufferers in the change of epochs. Past the red-coated sentry to the door of the palace we drove. A few words on a card brought a secretary with a startled face, and scarce 5 minutes had elapsed before Maxwell was ushered in. Dorothy and I remained in the car. As Maxwell left, he remarked, "Orrington, under any ordinary circumstances I'd ask for an audience for you, but now there's no time to be lost. I can get an immediate interview alone where I could not get one with you." "That's all right," I said apathetically. "I'm glad not to be obliged to move." We waited before the palace the better part of an hour before the door opened and Maxwell emerged. As he came towards us, I could see that he was blowing his nose vigorously and that his eyes were moist. He got into the car without a word, but as we swung over the bridge into the park, Maxwell made his first remark, staring off into vacancy. "I always thought the king was about the finest man that England held. Now I know it." That was all I ever learned of the interview. But as we came by the Abbey, I heard a newsboy crying, "Destruction of the fleets!" and I looked inquiringly at Maxwell. He nodded in reply. "We published it first. I telephoned the news from the palace." Weary and sad as I was, broken with the horror of the day, my purpose had become stronger than ever before. As we ran slowly through Whitehall and around to the Savoy, the thoughts of the past were disappearing in cogitations as to the effect this would have upon our search for the man. Though every battleship in the world was sunk, my purpose held good. I would find the destroyer. The next morning came a startling announcement. The King of England, the President of the United States, the President of the French Republic, the Mikado of Japan, the Tsar of Russia, issued immediate call for representatives of all nations to assemble at The Hague to consider the question of disarmament. That in itself differed but little from other summonses which had resulted in academic discussions. But the paragraph which succeeded the call was one of the most extraordinary the world had ever seen. The 5 rulers who issued this invitation each pledged himself to do everything in his power to bring about complete disarmament, and to end war in the whole world. In view of the urgency of the situation, the meeting was to be held in a month at The Hague. It was soon learned that the initiative in this step had come from the King of England, that the 4 other rulers had gladly joined with him in the action when asked concerning it by wireless, and that the Emperor of Germany had been invited to make one of the number, but had refused. That seemed to leave Germany as the stumbling block in the way. Complete disarmament was wholly possible if every nation were to agree. If a single powerful nation refused to disarm, it became practically an impossibility, for no nation would give up her defences with a powerful armoured foe at her gates. I had scarcely finished reading the account in the morning paper as a waiter approached with a wireless message from the office. Take 3 weeks' vacation and then go to The Hague as special correspondent for a peace conference. Confound it! I ejaculated as I read the missive. Look at this! And I passed the paper over to Tom and Dorothy. Tom's face fell. Of course it's a good thing in a way, said Tom, but it takes you right off the track of the man. I refuse to go off the track, I said warmly. I'm going to wire them back refusing this. Oh, I wouldn't do that, interrupted Dorothy eagerly. You stand almost or quite as much of a chance to get the news of the man at the peace conference as elsewhere. We can take the wave measuring machine right over to The Hague and work from there. Besides, I want the 3 weeks' vacation. Better take the vacation and put it in with me down at Cambridge, remarked Tom. They're doing some work in one of the colleges that might help me with the Denkel machine. I'd like to watch it a while and see its bearing on the case. Dorothy would have enjoyed it once, but now she's hopeless. You 2 could come down, though, and roam round for 3 weeks there as well as anywhere else. It's a jolly country, and we'll have a good time. Well, if you feel convinced it's the thing to do, I'll do it, I said resignedly. But I want to put in 3 weeks here in London, getting things together. We've never run down the Cragent clue yet. You are neither of you going to do any such thing, remarked Dorothy firmly. I'll tell you what you are going to do for the next 3 weeks. You're going to Paris with me. Oh, pshaw, said Tom disgustedly. Paris is a hole. I want to go to Cambridge. Do you like Paris, Jim? Not particularly, I said, with some hesitation. But then we're going, said Dorothy. What for? Said Tom argumentatively. Well, if you must know, said Dorothy, blushing, I want to shop. Tom burst into a roar of laughter, and I looked at him in bewilderment. He leaned over towards me. Got the cards engraved yet, Jim? Dorothy blushed still more. I saw a sudden light. Of course we go to Paris, I said enthusiastically. It's the place of places. And you'll sit around for hours waiting in a dinky little cab or in a motor car on the Boulevard Haussmann while Dorothy spends her patrimony inside. Is there a special duty on trousseau, Dorothy? He asked, with an affectation of seriousness. Oh, I wish you'd stop, said Dorothy emphatically. All right, said Tom. Only I thought I'd better wire my banker to see if my balance would leave us anything to go home on. 3 weeks in Paris, hours when I sat and smoked outside big shops and little shops, afternoons in the Bois, little dinners à trois at great restaurants, life and light and joy. 3 weeks with Dorothy, then the day express to The Hague, and a week of watching the arrival of the envoys, while Tom, who had run across an old assistant of Carl Denkel's, set up the wave-measuring machine, and spent his days working over it, in an attempt to widen its scope and bring it nearer to its ever-present mission. It still remained our chief reliance for our search. Anxious as I was to return to the quest of the man, the work at The Hague proved fascinating in the extreme. My daily report told of the coming of representatives from almost every nation, and, best of all, told of the free and full powers given them to agree to complete disarmament, provided it could be universal. Day after day, in the month which intervened between the calling of the convention and the opening of the meeting, had come reports of parliaments and congresses hastily gathered together to consider the question, and of their eager passing of favourable votes. One by one they came, till every nation had joined in consent, save one. Germany still held aloof. Since the disappearance of the fleets, the German Emperor had made no movement to advance the war, but kept his armies gathered, his transports riding at anchor in the ports. The Reichstag met, and discussed most favourably the call to the Hague, waiting anxiously for some sign from its imperial master, but none came. In absolute seclusion, in a lone castle in the depths of the Black Forest, he sulked like Achilles in his tent. The first day of meeting came with every power represented save Germany. The second and third passed with no sign from Berlin. On the fourth I began to see signs of difficulty. It was evident that the consent of the German Empire was a sine qua non. Delegate after delegate arose and expressed the eager desire of his country to disarm and bring about universal peace, provided, and the provided was emphatic, all other nations did the same. On the evening of the fourth day an American delegate rose, and by a powerful speech so roused the assembly that a delegation was appointed to meet the German Emperor and ask him, in the name of the conference, to join with the other nations. After the delegation was named, the meeting adjourned for 3 days until they could return. On the night when the delegates were to return, I was in my place in the correspondence section of the hall of the conference. The meeting came to order, the preliminary business was finished, and the presiding officer arose to say that the delegates had been delayed in returning, but had telegraphed that they would be there within an hour. He had scarcely finished speaking when a door opened and a marshal announced, "The delegation sent to His Majesty, the Emperor of Germany." Travel-worn and weary, the 5 men walked up the aisle to the space at front. "Gentlemen, are you ready to report?" said the presiding officer. "We are," said the head of the delegation. "The Emperor of Germany refused absolutely to see us, pleading an indisposition. We were unable to obtain any satisfaction." The grave assembly rose like the sea. Shouts, cries, requests for recognition came in one clamorous volume, and the president sounded his gavel fiercely. The excitable Latins were shouting recriminations. It looked as if the seething mass would break up in utter disorder, and the great conference would end without result. Far off by the door I could see a marshal forcing his way through the crowded aisles, imploring, struggling, fighting. He reached the rostrum, mounted it, and spoke in the president's ear. With a tremendous effort he shouted, "Silence for important news!" Little by little the crowd stilled. In a resonant voice came the words, "An envoy from the Emperor of Germany desires to address the conference in person." A hush came over the assembly, a hush so sudden, so profound, that I could hear the scratching of the fountain pen with which the secretary before the president wrote the words. The aisles cleared, and the ordered assembly sat silently in their seats. The great door opened, and preceded by a corps of marshals, the envoy from the great Hohenzollern entered. The stiff, unbending figure, the haughty head, the piercing eyes and high upturned moustache of the field marshal envoy showed his imitation of his master, the warlord. Proudly, as on parade, he paced to the space where the president, who had descended to the floor to greet him, stood. He bowed coldly and turned. "My master has sent me here," he said abruptly, "to address your conference. These are his words. I have believed that war, that armies made for the best good of my state. I believe it still. I do not believe in peace, but I cannot expose my navy to destruction, my sailors and my soldiers to death. I therefore agree to peace. My army shall disband, my fortifications be torn down, my battleships sunk or turned to peaceful ends. My Reichstag will have confirmed my words ere now." As one man, the assembly arose and cheered. Never in his own city or from his own troops came heartier greetings than that which rung out for the last ruler to take up the cause of peace. The field marshal stood there, while the tumult raged, his hands resting on the hilt of his sword, erect as ever, impassive as ever. As the cheering ended, he bowed to the assembly. Turning, he bowed to the president, and then, with martial step, he slowly withdrew. The delegates from Germany arrived the next day with power to disarm, and the business of signing the agreements and plans of disarmament went on so rapidly that the conference was able to adjourn in but a few days' time. The day the conference closed, I rushed back from the telegraph office the moment I had sent off the last word of my final despatch. I found Tom and Dorothy in the laboratory. "There! Thank goodness!" I cried exultantly. "That's over. Now I can go back to the hunt for the man with an easy conscience. What do you think that next move ought to be?" "Hold on till we finish this," said Tom. "We'll talk things over as soon as I get this screw set." I watched him idly as he worked. "What is he trying to do now?" I asked Dorothy. Just as I spoke, Tom moved his hand. The low buzz of a Ruhmkorff coil broke in on the silence of the room, and the glorious beauty of the tube of unknown gas that we had found in Heidenmuller's laboratory illumined the place. "Why, there's the gas tube!" I cried in amazement. "Yes," said Dorothy. "From that tube has come a marvelous development of the Dinkel apparatus. Tom has been able to receive with it right along, but never send. One day he thought of placing that tube of gas in the circuit, and now he can send as well as receive. Tom has done a big thing. He can reverse the action of the machine, not only receive a message from any place, but shoot a wireless back across space and have it strike exactly where he wishes. It's really a wonderful development, but I don't see how it's going to help us find the man. And I don't want to give up. There, Tom is finishing. We'll talk things over now." "If the man's crusade were not over, it might be even more effective," I remarked reflectively. "It would have been strange enough if we had found him by means of the gas released from the metal destroyed by his terrific power." "It would have been," answered Dorothy. I stood watching Tom, as, pipe in mouth, he set the revolving belt in motion and watched the moving cylinders. "To what strength of wave is it adjusted?" I asked. "I've put it on the high," said Tom. "It's fixed for the man's waves. I've got one new dodge, though, among others. I have it arranged so I could have told at any time whether the man was sinking a ship or just experimenting. It's so delicate that when his waves strike a ship, the machine can tell it by the slightest loss in power. See here." He turned on the switch in its revolution. "It's this." Flash went the beam. A groan burst from Dorothy's lips. "He's at it again! There's a ship gone down!" Tom's face was ghastly. "That's right," he said. "Where is he?" 5 minutes' calculation brought it. "He's in Tokyo," said Dorothy. Tom nodded. "What a fiend to have loose in the world. Here his mission is accomplished, and war is over, and he keeps on." Dorothy sprang from her chair. "No, it isn't that. I'm sure of it. He doesn't know that war is over. It must be that. We must tell him of it."